ground was shaking. Enemy tanks were already inside the perimeter. Engines roaring close enough to feel through the dirt, radios screaming over each other. The map was useless. Command had already written them off. The lieutenant looked around at what was left of the squad and finally said it. "We're done." That's when the quiet private reached into her rucksack and pulled out this, a tiny quadcopter. Plastic frame, civilian grade, the kind you'd see in a hobby shop. Laughter broke out. "That's a kid's toy. Put it away. We don't have time for this." She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She pressed one button. The drone lifted. Low, slow, quiet. She flew it straight toward the lead tank. They saw it. They tracked it. They fired. Missed. The drone didn't dodge, didn't attack, didn't do anything that made sense. It just hovered. And then something shifted. Enemy movement slowed. Orders repeated. Units hesitated. Not like they were confused. Like they were remembering something they weren't supposed to remember. No explosion, no obvious attack, just a pause that shouldn't have existed. Before we tell you what happened next, tell us where you're watching from and hit subscribe. Because what followed was never reported, never taught, and buried for one reason only. It worked. The pause didn't feel like relief. It felt like the breath before a mistake finishes forming. No one spoke, not on their side, not on the other. Dust drifted in thin sheets across the ground, settling on boots that had stopped shifting, rifles that were no longer being adjusted. Even the engines seemed to idle lower, as if the battlefield itself was listening. The lieutenant slowly lowered his binoculars. His knuckles were white. "Why aren't they moving?" he asked, not expecting an answer. The quiet private didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the drone, on the way it held its position with absolute indifference, neither advancing nor retreating. "Because they're deciding," she said. "Deciding what? Whether they trust what they're hearing more than what they're seeing." Across the field, the lead tank's turret nudged left, then stopped. Infantry clustered tighter around their radios. Orders came through again. The same phrasing repeated twice, then a third time with a different emphasis. Not command anymore, confirmation. The kind of tone people use when they're trying to convince themselves. If you were standing there, watching an enemy force hesitate with every advantage on its side, would you assume it was a trick? Or would you feel the same unease settling in your chest? One of the squad laughed softly, the sound brittle. "This doesn't make sense." She nodded once. "It doesn't have to." The lieutenant crouched beside her, lowering his voice. "What did you send them?" "I didn't send them anything." He stared at the controller in her hands. "Then what changed?" "They remembered something," she said, "and now they can't unremember it." Another tank rolled forward half a meter, then stopped as if it had hit an invisible line. A soldier climbed partway out of a hatch, scanning the ground for wires, mines, anything that explained the hesitation. He found nothing. Just a small drone and a silence that felt wrong. The lieutenant keyed his radio, then stopped. For the first time since the perimeter was breached, there were no new orders coming down. Command hadn't cut them off. Command had gone quiet. That was worse. "Do we move?" someone asked. He didn't answer right away. He watched the enemy line instead, the way weapons dipped then rose again, the way heads kept turning toward the drone as if it were a person who might speak. Would you push forward because the plan said you should, or wait because something deep in your instincts was telling you the rules had just changed? "She's buying us time," another voice said. The private didn't react. She adjusted her grip slightly, thumb hovering near the controller, not tense, not relaxed, waiting. Minutes passed like that, not many, enough. Then the enemy advance didn't resume. A ripple moved through their formation, subtle but unmistakable. Vehicles repositioned away from the center, infantry spread out instead of pressing forward. Someone on the far side shouted a new order, sharper than the last. It wasn't followed. The lieutenant exhaled slowly. "They're pulling back," he said, disbelief creeping into his voice. "For now," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked. "Who taught you this?" She finally met his eyes. Someone who learned the hard way what scares people more than weapons. The drone remained where it was, small and unremarkable against the steel and dust. Whatever had started out there was still unfolding, and no one on the field could say where it would stop. Some victories announce themselves, others arrive quietly and leave everyone arguing later about whether they were victories at all. By the time the first enemy unit reversed course, the quiet private was already thinking several steps ahead, because hesitation never lasts forever, and when it ends, someone always pays for the pause. The pullback didn't look like retreat. It looked like correction. Enemy vehicles shifted position with deliberate care, reversing just far enough to regain spacing. Infantry moved with them, not running, not panicking, just recalibrating as if someone had quietly rewritten the rules mid-move. Radios stayed busy, but the tone had changed. Fewer commands, more questions, shorter sentences, clipped and careful. The lieutenant stood slowly. "They're not leaving," he said. "They're thinking." "That's worse," someone muttered. The quiet private finally lowered the drone a fraction, not enough to land, just enough to signal patience. "They'll probe next," she said. "They always do." "Probe how?" "By trying to make sense of it." As if on cue, a single armored vehicle edged forward again, slower than before. Its turret rotated, sweeping the ground, searching for mines, transmitters, anything that could be pointed to later and labeled as the cause. The drone didn't react. It didn't adjust altitude or speed. It stayed where it was, unhelpfully ordinary. What would you look for in that moment if you were responsible for hundreds of lives? An explanation you could brief or reassurance you could sell? A voice crackled over the squad's radio, higher command at last. "Confirm asset deployment," the voice said. "We're seeing irregular movement." The lieutenant glanced at the private. "What do I tell them?" She thought for a beat. "Tell them nothing changed." He hesitated. "That's a lie." "No," she said softly. "That's perspective." He relayed it anyway. There was a pause on the other end, longer than professional silence should ever last. "Understood," the voice finally replied, though it clearly wasn't. The probing vehicle stopped again. This time, it cut its engine. That sound, or the absence of it, traveled farther than any explosion. One by one, other engines followed. The field settled into an unnatural stillness, broken only by wind moving smoke across metal. A soldier near the private leaned closer. "What are they hearing?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes tracked the enemy line, noting who was speaking to whom, who kept glancing at their radios, who looked away from the drone as if it might look back. "They're hearing confirmation," she said, "just not the kind they want." "Confirmation of what?" "That someone knows them." The lieutenant frowned. "Knows them how?" She finally landed the drone, cradling it in her hand like it was nothing more than it appeared to be. "You train people long enough, you learn their habits," she said. "How they speak when they're calm, how they repeat themselves when they're not, how they recognize authority." "Authority doesn't come from a toy," someone scoffed, quieter now. "No," she agreed. "It comes from familiarity." Across the field, an enemy officer raised his hand, signaling his unit to hold. Another officer ignored him, issuing a different instruction seconds later. The two looked at each other. Something passed between them that wasn't settled by rank. If you were in their boots, which would scare you more, a threat you could see or a doubt you couldn't trace? The lieutenant felt the weight of it then. This wasn't about the drone. It was about interruption, a disruption of certainty. He'd seen it before in training scenarios, the way exercises fell apart when one variable refused to behave as expected. This was that, scaled up and unforgiving. "Command wants to know what doctrine this falls under," his radio crackled again. The private allowed herself the smallest smile. "It doesn't." Another long pause, then quieter. "Stand by." Stand by. Not advance, not engage, not retreat, just wait. The lieutenant looked out at the stalled battlefield, at an enemy force suddenly unsure of its own momentum. He realized something then that tightened his chest. This wasn't a fluke. This was deliberate. She's done this before, he thought. The way she watched, the way she anticipated responses before they happened. This wasn't improvisation. It was recognition. The enemy didn't push. They didn't withdraw. They held. And in that holding pattern, time stretched thin, dangerous and valuable all at once, because hesitation, once introduced, spreads faster than confidence ever did, and no one there could say who would lose control of it first. The waiting began to feel heavier than the fighting ever had. Minutes passed, then more. The sun shifted just enough to cast longer shadows off the tanks, turning their steel outlines into something almost skeletal. No one fired, no one advanced. The battlefield had slipped into a strange, in-between state where every sound felt louder because it was unexpected. The lieutenant finally broke the silence. They're burning daylight. That's the point, the private replied. She hadn't moved from her position, kneeling, balanced, as if the ground beneath her belonged to her more than anyone else. They're trying to decide whether time is on their side, or ours. Across the field, a new radio frequency crackled to life. It wasn't broadcast loudly enough to be heard by the squad, but the reaction was immediate. Several enemy soldiers turned toward the same armored vehicle. One raised his hand, another shook his head. A third leaned in close to the radio, speaking low and fast. The lieutenant watched it unfold and felt a chill crawl up his spine. "That's not coordination," he said. "That's argument." "Yes," she said, "and arguments mean authority is already slipping." He glanced at her again, searching her face for signs of nerves, adrenaline, anything that would make this feel normal. There was nothing, just focus, not cold, not aggressive, controlled. "How do you know what they're arguing about?" he asked. "Because I've heard it before," she replied. "Different language, same cadence." The squad shifted uneasily. Someone wiped sweat from their eyes, another adjusted a rifle strap that didn't need adjusting. Everyone felt it now, the sense that something irreversible had been set in motion, even if no one could name it yet. If you'd been trained your entire life to obey clear chains of command, what would shake you more? A direct order to advance or an order that suddenly sounded unsure? On the far side, a tank commander climbed fully out of his hatch. He scanned the ground again, slower this time, then turned and shouted something toward another vehicle. The response came late, too late. A delay measured in seconds but heavy with meaning. The lieutenant's radio buzzed, higher command again. "We're seeing conflicting signals on their net," the voice said. "Stand by." "Stand by." Again. He lowered the radio and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "They don't know what to do," he said. "They do," the private corrected gently. "They just don't agree." The first crack came without warning. Not gunfire, not movement. A white cloth appeared from the side of a troop carrier, tentative, almost embarrassed, then vanished just as quickly when someone yanked it back inside. A mistake, or a test. Every eye on the field locked onto it. The lieutenant's heart hammered. "Did you see that?" "Yes. That looked like—" "It was," she said, "and now they're going to fight about it." The squad held its breath. Across the field, the brief gesture rippled outward. Officers shouted. A man slammed his fist against the side of a vehicle. Another pointed toward the drone, his expression unreadable from this distance. The private finally stood, not fast, not slow. She clipped the controller to her vest and stepped forward half a pace, visible now to anyone watching. She wasn't threatening, she wasn't hiding. She was simply there. If you were watching from the other side, would you see confidence or inevitability? The lieutenant felt the weight of that step. "You're sure about this?" he said quietly. She didn't answer him right away. She watched the enemy line, counting heartbeats. Then she said, "Certainty isn't the goal. Consensus is." Another vehicle shut down its engine, then another. One by one, the sound of power faded until the field was held together by nothing but wind and nerves. The squad didn't cheer. No one smiled. This wasn't triumph. It was something more fragile. Because somewhere in that silence, someone on the other side was going to make a choice. And whatever that choice was, it would define everything that came next. The silence didn't break. It deepened. The lieutenant realized then that this was the most dangerous moment of the entire engagement, not the breach, not the tanks, not even the order to surrender. This, the stretch of time where everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first irreversible move. Across the field, the enemy commanders separated into clusters, voices raised now, hands slicing the air in sharp gestures. Whatever hierarchy they'd arrived with was being tested in public. Authority was no longer assumed, it was being argued. The private watched it all with a stillness that felt almost reverent. She wasn't watching the machines, she was watching people, who spoke first, who was ignored, who kept glancing away when challenged, patterns most would miss unless they knew exactly what to look for. The lieutenant leaned closer. If they regroup, if someone reasserts control, does this end? Yes, she said, immediately. And then? Then they advance harder than before. He swallowed. So this only works once. She nodded. Everything important does. If you were in her place, knowing that a single miscalculation could turn hesitation into massacre, Would you press further, or freeze and hope the moment holds? A new voice cut through the enemy radios, louder, sharper, unmistakably authoritative. The private's eyes narrowed. "There," she murmured. The lieutenant followed her gaze. A senior commander had arrived at the edge of the formation, flanked by aides. He spoke without hesitation, issuing orders that sounded final. Vehicles began to realign. The pause trembled. The private moved, not dramatically, not fast. She unclipped something from her vest and adjusted the drone again, sending it up just enough to be seen. Still slow, still quiet, but deliberate. The senior commander stopped mid-sentence, his head tilted slightly, as if he'd heard something that didn't belong where it was. He turned, listening. The aides leaned in. Confusion flickered across his face. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. The lieutenant felt it like a pressure change. "What did you just do?" "I reminded him," she said. "Of what?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The effect was immediate. The commander's confidence wavered, just for a fraction of a second. But that was enough. One aide spoke out of turn. Another contradicted him. The clean chain snapped. Across the formation, movement stalled again. The lieutenant stared. "You didn't overpower them," he said slowly. "No," she replied. "I interrupted them." The battlefield held its breath. Somewhere, a decision was being delayed past the point of safety. Somewhere else, a soldier was wondering if today was the day he died because someone higher up couldn't agree on what reality was anymore. Would you follow an order that suddenly sounded uncertain, even if every instinct told you not to? The senior commander turned away from the line, speaking rapidly into his radio now, voice tight. Whatever he was hearing back didn't satisfy him. His shoulders sagged just slightly. A human tell, the kind training manuals never mention. Then came the signal. Not a charge, not a retreat, a withdrawal. Slow at first, measured, vehicles reversing in sequence, infantry stepping back in disciplined waves, careful not to look like they were running, pride salvaged, if nothing else. The lieutenant let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped for hours. Around him, the squad sagged, tension draining from bodies that had been braced for impact. "It's over," someone whispered. The private didn't agree. She powered down the drone and stowed it carefully, as if it were fragile. "No," she said. "It's remembered." He didn't understand what she meant yet. He would later. Because as the enemy disappeared beyond the ridge, leaving the field intact and inexplicable behind them, one thing became painfully clear. They hadn't lost. They had learned. And learning, in war, has a way of coming back for payment. The withdrawal left behind a kind of quiet that felt unfinished. When the last enemy vehicle vanished beyond the ridge, no one on the squad celebrated. Rifles stayed raised longer than necessary. Eyes stayed fixed on the empty ground, where armor had been moments ago, as if something might suddenly remember it was supposed to happen and come back. The lieutenant finally lowered his weapon. "I've never seen that," he said. "Not like that." "Neither have they," the private replied. Command reappeared on the radio 10 minutes later, breathless and overly calm, the way people sound when they're pretending control never slipped. Questions came fast: asset identification, confirmation of enemy intent, requests for explanation that assumed there was one neat answer waiting. The lieutenant glanced at her again before responding. "Enemy disengaged," he reported. "Cause unclear." There was a pause. Unclear how. He hesitated, then, choosing carefully, unclear why. That answer traveled upward, where analysts would soon tear it apart looking for a technical failure, a hidden jammer, a new weapon system. They would diagram signals and cross-reference frequencies and find nothing they could comfortably point to. Because what had broken out there wasn't hardware. It was confidence. As the squad began resetting the perimeter, the private moved apart from them, sitting on a broken slab of concrete and cleaning dust from the drone's casing with her sleeve. She handled it gently, like something borrowed rather than owned. One of the younger soldiers approached, still shaken. "How did you know?" he asked. "That it would work?" She didn't look up. "I didn't." He frowned. "Then why do it?" She finally met his eyes. "Because they were already hesitating. I just gave that hesitation a shape." If you knew an enemy was on the edge of doubt, would you push them, or would you risk everything hoping doubt would finish the job for you? Later, in the temporary command shelter, the lieutenant sat across from her while officers he'd never met watched through flickering screens. Faces leaned closer. Voices stayed neutral. Dangerous questions disguised as curiosity. "Where did you learn this?" one asked. She shrugged. "Watching people." "That's not doctrine." "No," she agreed. "That's experience." Another voice cut in. "You're saying you didn't transmit anything?" "I'm saying they heard something they recognized." Silence followed, the kind that signals discomfort, not confusion. Someone cleared their throat. "We'll need to classify this." "Why?" she asked. "Because if it works," the voice replied carefully, "it works both ways." That was the moment the lieutenant understood the real cost of what she'd done, not the risk on the ground, but the risk to systems built on the belief that control could always be maintained. Outside, the sun dipped lower, washing the battlefield in a light that made everything look deceptively peaceful. The squad rested, medics moved. The drone sat back in her pack, indistinguishable from spare batteries and rations. The lieutenant stepped out beside her as evening settled. "They're going to bury this," he said. She nodded. "They always do." "Does that bother you?" She considered the question, eyes tracking the horizon where the enemy had withdrawn. "No," she said finally. "Forgetting is safer than misunderstanding." He watched her for a long moment. "You could have explained yourself out there?" "Yes, but you didn't." She met his gaze again. "Would it have worked if I had?" He had no answer, because sometimes the most powerful thing on a battlefield isn't the force you apply, but the meaning you leave unresolved. Night fell without ceremony. No victory brief, no debrief alarms, just the quiet logistics of survival resuming as if the afternoon had been a weather delay instead of something that would follow people home in their sleep. Floodlights hummed to life along the perimeter. Boots crunched through debris. The lieutenant stood alone near the outer berm, replaying the moment the enemy line stalled, the way certainty had leaked out of them in real time. He had seen retreats before. He had never seen a withdrawal that felt embarrassed. Behind him, the private sat on an ammo crate, helmet off, hair pulled back tight, face unreadable. Someone handed her a bottle of water. She nodded thanks but didn't drink. Her eyes were on the dark ridge, not because she expected movement, but because she didn't trust stillness. Higher command arrived digitally first, secure lines, redundant authentication, a procession of voices asking the same questions in different ways. What exactly did you deploy? What frequencies were used? What behavioral indicators preceded disengagement? The lieutenant answered what he could, which wasn't much. Eventually, they asked for her. She didn't flinch when the camera feed opened. Faces filled the screen, ranks without names, expressions careful. One of them leaned forward. "You understand the position you've put us in?" "Yes." "Do you understand why this can't be repeated?" "Yes." A pause, then, softer. "Do you understand why we need to know how you did it?" She considered that. The room waited. "If you reduce it to a method," she said, "you'll use it at the wrong time." Another pause. Longer now. Someone exchanged a look off-screen. "Explain," a different voice said. She met the camera. What stopped them wasn't technology. It was doubt. And doubt doesn't behave the same way twice. If you were sitting in that room, responsible for doctrine and lives, would you trust something you couldn't standardize? Or would that uncertainty terrify you more than the enemy ever could? The lieutenant watched the exchange, feeling the ground shift again, this time under authority instead of armor. He realized then that the hesitation she'd introduced hadn't stopped at the ridge. It had followed the signal all the way up the chain. Finally, a senior voice spoke. "This will be classified. No dissemination, no after-action training." She nodded once. "That's wise." The feed cut. Just like that. Later, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, the lieutenant found her again near the perimeter. "They're afraid of it," he said. "They should be," she replied. "Of you?" "No, of what happens when people realize certainty is optional." He leaned against the barrier, staring into the dark. "You ever think about what happens when the other side figures it out?" She did drink then, a slow sip. "They already did," she said. "That's why they stopped." The thought sat between them, heavy. The enemy hadn't withdrawn because they were beaten. They had withdrawn because they had learned something they couldn't unknow. That was more dangerous. "What do you do now?" he asked. She packed the drone away, careful, deliberate. "I go back to being invisible." He almost laughed. "After today?" She looked at him, and for the first time, there was something like weariness there. Especially after today. Because moments like this didn't create heroes, they created problems. Problems institutions preferred to erase quietly. As she walked away into the floodlit camp, the lieutenant understood something that hadn't been in any briefing. The battlefield hadn't ended at the perimeter. It had simply moved inward, into reports, into meetings, into the long memory of people who had watched control slip and never fully return. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the enemy was doing the same math. The report was finished before dawn. 3 pages, sanitized language, phrases like enemy disengagement due to unknown factors and no confirmed technological anomaly. The kind of document designed to be filed, not remembered. The lieutenant read it twice, then a third time, looking for her name. It wasn't there. She was already gone. No ceremony, no reassignment briefing, just an empty rack where her gear had been, a clean space where someone efficient had erased themselves. The drone was logged, sealed, transferred to a place the lieutenant would never see. He knew better than to ask where. Later that morning, command called again, not to praise, not to reprimand, to caution. "This engagement will not be referenced," the voice said. "It introduces variables we cannot afford to normalize." He almost argued, almost said that what she'd done saved lives on both sides, almost said that hesitation had prevented a slaughter. But he heard the unspoken part clearly enough. If uncertainty became a weapon, no one stayed comfortable. Would you want a battlefield where control could dissolve without warning, where authority depended not on force, but on belief? The lieutenant walked the perimeter one last time before rotation. The ground was calm now. No tanks, no smoke, just tire tracks fading into dirt and a stretch of land that looked unchanged to anyone who hadn't been there. He stopped where the drone had hovered. Nothing marked the spot, no scorch, no crater, just ordinary ground that felt right somehow. Whatever had happened here was never meant to leave a scar you could point to. Weeks later, fragments filtered in. The enemy unit had rotated commanders, internal reviews, quiet purges, conflicting accounts of why an advance had stalled without contact. Some blamed equipment, others blamed hesitation. No one agreed. That disagreement lingered. And disagreement, once introduced, doesn't stay contained. Some nights, the lieutenant replayed the moment the field went quiet, the way confidence had bled out of the air, the way a small, unremarkable thing had shifted the balance without announcing itself. He wondered how many other battles turned not on firepower, but on the moment someone decided the plan no longer made sense. He never saw her again, but once, months later, during a different operation in a different place, he heard a junior officer say something that made him stop cold. "They're hesitating," the officer said, "like they're waiting for something they don't want to hear." The lieutenant said nothing. He just watched the line ahead, feeling that old pressure return. Some knowledge doesn't spread through manuals or briefings. It moves sideways, quietly, from memory to instinct, from fear to restraint. The quiet private had known that. She hadn't defeated an enemy. She had shown them a mirror at the wrong moment, and once someone sees themselves clearly in the middle of a fight, they don't charge forward the same way again. If stories like this matter to you, stories about the moments that don't make headlines but change outcomes, then you already understand what Mindfront is about. Subscribe to Mindfront and stay with us for the stories that were never meant to be remembered but should be.